Kia ora and welcome to the first in a series of videos on keywords in critical media studies. And the first word we're going to tackle today is cloud. So you may have heard about your data being in the cloud, a certain platform or product that runs in the cloud. Some service goes down because the cloud provider goes down. So the cloud really, this has become a really critical infrastructure for today. But what is the cloud, and what are some key ideas or key issues that we should pay attention to when we talk about the cloud? So first, what is the cloud? The cloud, in essence, is a set of data centers, often distributed globally. So a data center is basically a big building. It has rows and rows of servers, these special computers designed to receive data. They store a lot of data, video, audio, images, and so on. They can process that data in particular ways and then deliver up the results and send it back to you as the user, around the world. So the data center is basically this big building containing these many servers on a sort of industrial scale, right? And these buildings are often quite hard to get to. They're under high security, and so they can be quite difficult to research. And so we have this kind of critical infrastructure that's often out of sight, out of mind in a way. So the first point then, I think, when we start to talk about the cloud is that the cloud is material. So the cloud, when we hear about it in popular discourse, in tech journalism and so on, is often referred to as this kind of nebulous, vague thing out there, right? Your data is on the cloud, don't worry about it. Where, in this case, is sort of wherever. It doesn't really matter where the cloud is located. But actually, the cloud then is this very physical, material thing. It's made up of chips and processors and hard drives and racks and cables, buildings, larger cables, that for electricity and for connecting data between jurisdictions or underneath the ocean, right? So it's this sort of sprawling infrastructure that's actually very physical. And so that comes with a lot of implications. I think it has environmental implications, which we'll talk about briefly later. But it also means that it can be investigated. It's this physical material thing. It means it breaks down. It means that there's a certain cloud infrastructure that we can look at in particular places, and this infrastructure changes from place to place, right? So the fact that it's material has a lot of implications that we can start to think about. All right, so the second point then is that the cloud is historical. So when you start to think about where the cloud is, the kind of key draw, the key benefit for the cloud, for a lot of customers, for corporations and so on, is that these data centers are globally distributed, right? So the idea is that we don't just have one data center in one location, but we have them all around the world. And so when you, as a customer in Sao Paulo or Seoul, need to get a particular file or need to get a kind of quick response, then the data center that you access will be hopefully quite close by, right? And so this idea then of the cloud being this collection of data centers, and the benefit then is of having very close data centers that cut down on latency or lag, allow you to get a really quick response, a really nice streaming video, and so on, right? And so distance matters, again, about materiality. And so then, large corporations then use these cloud infrastructures that have locations all around the world. So this global distribution is really important, but at the same time, the cloud does not appear from nowhere, right? It doesn't just emerge overnight. These data infrastructures are built up over time, and these infrastructures then are typically built in places where there's already existing telecommunications infrastructure, right? So in that sense, they're sort of piggybacking off the back of historical infrastructure. Things like, we can think about London, for instance, which had early telegraph, early telecommunications infrastructure, right? And so we see this kind of early development of data centers and data hubs in particular cities. And this is why scholars, talk about colonialism and about capitalism when we start to think about the cloud, because the development of this infrastructure then follows trade routes, follows early information pathways, and sort of adheres to the history of colonialism and capitalism, right? And that all that means that cloud infrastructure is not equally distributed, perfectly across the globe, but we have this kind of asymmetries, uneven distribution of this infrastructure. And this uneven distribution then provides sort of unequal access, right? So we have, in some cases, quite dense infrastructures in the global north, whereas we have sort of big pockets of empty space. You might have to go a lot further to the closest data center if you're living in particular spots in the so-called global south, right? And that, of course, is changing quite quickly. We see, in the last few years, data centers spun up, particularly in Southeast Asia and other locations. So that is shifting, but we can then start to think about, who has access to data, to quick responses, to ownership over that data transfer and so on, and who does not, who gets a sort of second-rate service or is required to use things like mobile data, which can be very expensive, right? So again, it comes back to power, about access, about privilege, these kinds of issues. So cloud is historical, and then thirdly, we can think about the ways in which the cloud is environmental. We've already said that the cloud is material, and that comes with, obvious implications, I think, for the environment. In the last decade, I think we've seen this rapid expansion of cloud infrastructures, data infrastructures, to match this sort of voracious demand of customers and companies, particularly as we get into rich media, video, streaming services. That's one kind of key driver for this rapid expansion of data infrastructures. Another has been AI, machine learning. Training these models takes incredible amounts of processing power, which is quite specialized. So we see the rise then of very specialized data centers for that kind of demand. And so we see this sort of surge then really of cloud infrastructures, even though they're often invisible or unseen. And then all of that massive scale then obviously requires, massive resources to match it. And I think it's quite surprising then, how much water these infrastructures use for cooling. They require huge amounts of power, often connected redundantly to avoid going offline, right? So there's kind of these huge fail-safe mechanisms built in. These are often sprawling facilities that require a lot of land. So all of that requires these immense amount of resources. And here I think we need to remind ourselves that this was always a kind of double move, right? Where the cloud takes certain things, and that means that it's not available to other people, to other uses, right? So we can think about, massive data centers, taking all the water from a particular location, the American Southwest, for example, and that means that water then is not available to other communities, to other citizens for other uses, and so on. And so we get this kind of contested, right, the struggle over resources, and the environmental footprint, the carbon footprint of the cloud has been an issue that has risen to prominence in the last decade, particularly as we enter this new environmental crisis. Right, so the cloud then is material, the cloud is historical, and the cloud is environmental. I think these provide hopefully some jumping off points for your own work to think about the cloud and data infrastructures.